So it seemed very appropriate, especially in the light of James Ross Mellon's remarks, that we should have somebody coming to speak to us now about the contemporary challenge. Because the big argument is, what on earth can what use is a museum like this and a research centre like this focused on history any use to us in the challenges that face us today? Now, we're very lucky in we're having one of the I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying that Piers McHenry is, if not, certainly one of the leading analysts and commentators on current Irish migration in the country. But he also has a very strong historical perspective. We've got open on the book display over there his chapter in the magnificent Atlas of the Great Irish Famine, chapter on the Irish diaspora and the famine. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Piers to come and give us the 12th annual reunion lecture on that, the contemporary challenges and trends in Irish migration. So please give him a good welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Piers, you're very welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Díomh Margin. First of all, I'd like to thank Brian for an extraordinary exaggerated description of my own background, but I'd like to say first of all what a pleasure it is to be back here among friends. I've been coming here, as Brian says, for a long time. I think I first came here with my daughter Muireann, I think in the mid-1990s, and it was eye-opening for her and for me to see the whole history of Irish migration from a different perspective, from in particular the Scotch-Irish perspective, but also within a centre that was already developing what now is characteristic, and is a very economical approach where all shades of Irish migration history are embraced. And it's a great pleasure to be here again and to meet not only Brian, who's a very old friend at this stage, but also Paddy and Christine, and of course I'm delighted to see John Gilmore, because he was one of the earliest people that I had frequent contact with, and I've met Sir Peter Froggatt on several occasions too. And I think it's something to celebrate that with all the vicissitudes on both sides of the border that we've experienced in the last 20 years and more, that this centre continues to thrive and prosper, and is now in fact the only migration study centre on this island, and does indeed embrace a very broad mission, including the past and the present in its mandate. And I was kind of touched as well to hear Brian mention Syria this morning, because I didn't know what he was going to say about this, but my first encounter with the whole question of migration was in the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in 1982, just over 30 years ago. I was sent there as an Irish diplomat, and that was where I first met the reality of refugees in the circumstances immediately after the Israeli-inspired massacre of Palestinian refugees in September of that year. And that's what set me on the path that I have followed ever since, working in the Middle East with refugees there, and later then in Paris, researching the Irish today, and moving on to the kind of interest I have at the moment. So I have a very real interest and feeling for the Middle East and the whole issue of refugees and asylum seekers, and I've worked a good deal in that domain in Cork in the last 20 years in the NGO sector as well as an academic. I suppose the first thing to say is that I thought first when I came here, since I'm in Omagh and I'm in Northern Ireland, that it would be appropriate and sensitive to embrace the notion of looking at emigration from Ireland today, as it were, from both sides of the border. But in fact, we have had two different experiences, and we are in two different jurisdictions, without going into any sort of highly political question there. And in many ways, I'm not the person with the expertise on Northern Ireland. In fact, I can see one person who is, Joanne at the back there, who would have far more to say than I have on that topic, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say. So I think it's probably better, and in some ways as well, I don't want to present, as it were, particularly being a southerner, what might be seen as a kind of proprietary gesture in purporting to be an expert on something that I'm not as expert on, which is to say current trends from Northern Ireland, although I'm reasonably familiar with the overall figures. So I think it might be better to present this, as it were, as a report from the neighbours. But at the same time, I do want to start out, and I'm going to sort of consider two topics in my remarks today. One is what I'm going to call narratives of migration, discourses of migration, how we think about the subject. And the second one then is going to be present a little bit of what's been happening in the South in the last 20 years, because we're back again as we were in the 1980s and the 1950s and several previous periods before that, through a level of emigration which is really a matter for some concern. And how those debates are framed, it seems to me, have a different resonance in the South for a variety of reasons than they have here. And I want to really start by considering those and asking the question maybe, why does it matter as much or as much more apparently to Southerners than it does to Northerners? And some of the reasons may be obvious, some less so. And you may not agree with some of my analysis, and that's absolutely fine, because we'll have time to discuss afterwards. I gather I've got about 3/4 of an hour to talk to you, and then we have maybe half an hour for questions. And I've already asked Brian to interrupt me if I go on too long, so I'm going to get a warning about 5 minutes before the end. And I've got about 40 minutes left, I think, Brian. Right. Let's start out with two sort of images of or ideas of Irish emigration. This is a very well-known poem by the southern poet Evan Boland, The Emigrant Irish. And I'll just read it to you without further comment at this stage. The emigrant Irish, like oil lamps, we put them out the back of our houses, of our minds. We had lights better than, newer than, and then a time came, this time, and now we need them. Their dread, makeshift example. They would have thrived on our necessities. What they survived, we could not even live. By their lights now it is time to imagine how they stood there, what they stood with, what their possessions may become our power. Cardboard, iron, their hardships parcelled in them, patience, fortitude, long-suffering in the bruise-coloured dusk of the new world, and all the old songs, and nothing to lose. There's a long tradition, of course, of poems and indeed folk song about emigration in Ireland, but it captures the centrality, I think, and the sense of loss that emigration embodies for so many Irish people. Here's another image. Economic Pressure is one of the best-known paintings of, I suppose, what might be described as an iconic artist of the New Republic, or the Free State, as it would have been then. This is still hanging in the Crawford Municipal Art Gallery, Cork, and it's an image that's reproduced time and time again. You'll see it on book covers and you'll see it on websites and so on and so forth. And I suppose the reason I'm showing these two to begin with is that poem, The Emigrant Irish, captures the notion of a forgotten people. As it says in the first line, like oil lamps, we put them out the back. So there's a kind of a denial in the public domain in some respects, or at least there was for a very long time, about emigration and what it meant. On the other hand, this is the archetypal image. It's an island, it's a rural image. You have the father stoically gazing into the middle distance. He can't deal with this at all. The mother is saying a tearful farewell to the son who's about to get on the boat and emigrate. Never mind, by the way, the fact that at most times in Irish history there were far more women than male migrants. That's one of the things that we tend to ignore. But taking those two images, I suppose what I want to ask in the first place is, why is emigration so central, in particular to how we've thought about it in the Republic, as opposed to here in Northern Ireland? And some of the reasons are obvious. So, I mean, one reason to begin with that might be obvious is that if, for instance, you happen to be of a largely unionist persuasion, then in a certain way emigration or migration from this region to the neighbouring island is not going to be seen as emigration at all. It's going to be seen merely as internal migration, and to that extent it's associated with less drama and possibly less trauma, at least in public terms, than the way in which it has been characterised in other parts of the island. So there is that sense in which, for people of a certain political view, that kind of migration was not emigration at all. And even if you came from the nationalist tradition in the north, to some extent your history wasn't fully told either. So it didn't have, it seems to me, the centrality in life and culture in this part of the country that it has in the other. Second point, and we're going back into the historical period here, the legacy of the famine. And I do have a chapter about that, as Brian has mentioned in this book, The Atlas of the Great Irish Famine. And it seems to me that one of the central things about the legacy of the famine, which of course marked us all as a people throughout this island of whatever background, but one of the legacies of the famine actually comes from Irish America. And that is the way in which, in the 1860s in particular, Irish America began to reimagine itself and refashion its history. And I think the key text here is The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps, by John Mitchell. And it became very much a history of Irish America as oppressed and Catholic. And much of what had gone before that, including the century and a half during which emigration from Ireland had largely in fact been Protestant, is erased or discounted or sidelined in favour of this overwhelming new and, of course, understandable vision of victimhood, where to be Irish American is to be an oppressed Irish Catholic, and where there's a kind of a disconnect between the earlier traditions of Irish emigration and the later ones. Again, not in any way denigrating those traditions or saying that that reimagining isn't an understandable way in which these new migrants, the poor Irish who came after the famine, they had to make their way in a new world, and they had to imagine their own narrative for themselves in a way that made sense to them. But it meant that for that particular tradition, the whole notion of emigration, and emigration as exile, emigration as forced departure, emigration and the coffin ship, emigration and the American wake, that sort of extremely powerful myth becomes the overwhelming story, the overwhelming narrative of emigration as seen, at least by that part of the Irish population. So we forgot, for instance, that Protestants, admittedly not as much, but Protestants suffered during the famine as well as Catholics. We forgot a lot of what had previously united us. And we find, for instance, that in places like Philadelphia, what had previously been non-sectarian celebrations, for instance, of St. Patrick's Day, became confessionalised. Not in all cases and not in all places. I'm thinking, for instance, of Montreal, where the Protestant Irish Society continued to be extremely supportive of all sides of the Irish community. But nonetheless, there was this kind of centrality of the legacy of the famine, and I'm suggesting that part of that legacy was the confessionalisation not only of Irish America, but also about how we thought about emigration itself. It became a key myth, largely for nationalist Catholic Ireland, which didn't have the same resonance as I think for other Irish people of other backgrounds. It also became an embedded tradition. It did become the default option within an impoverished island, and in particular for certain parts of it, the south, the west, the northwest, it became the default option that you didn't have the opportunities offered, for instance, by industrialisation in the northeast around Belfast. So in fact, for many people growing up in rural Ireland, getting the boat became something which is seen as an entirely natural choice. And again, there is a distinction there, I think, between the choice as seen in that sort of framework compared to what it might be where people who would go to Belfast, for instance, and work there, and therefore didn't have to think about immigration. I'll come back to my contrast in Spain later, as I have a note there I shouldn't have put there. Failures of state and nation. Again, when we ask why is the narrative or the discourse, I mean how we talk about these things in public and political and popular terms, why is that narrative so central and so powerful for the South as opposed to the North? I think, again, the reasons are not too difficult to find. The foundation of the Southern state, the Irish Free State, back in 1922, was seen as a new departure. We could no longer blame the British for all of our ills. To some extent, if we had problems from then on, the fault lay with ourselves. And so, to some extent, the extraordinary emigration of the 1950s, for instance, when 500,000 people left, was seen not only as a tragedy in itself, but also, to a certain extent, as the potential failure of this new state. And that's never very far from popular thinking nowadays in the South. We saw the same thing in the 1980s. We saw the arrival of a similar level of migration. In fact, in the 1980s, again, roughly speaking, 500,000 people left again, admittedly from a larger population, so proportionately it wasn't quite as bad. But nonetheless, it was seen again as a major failure, politically, economically, socially, by the state, which purported to offer its people the opportunities they needed in terms of employment and living in a society and not having to leave. And again, we're experiencing once again nowadays the same return, and it does not have a parallel in terms of numbers to Northern Ireland. We're seeing the return of emigration on a level which is in many ways comparable to what it was in the 80s and the 50s. So in that sense, it is much more central, the whole question of emigration, how we think about it, to Southern thinking, I would suggest, than it is here. There's also the question of the economy, economic mismanagement. I'm not sort of going to talk this morning at length about the collapse of the Celtic Tiger, but in some very central ways, this economic failure and indeed the mismanagement and corruption and all the rest of it that went with it does kind of leave us again with not only enormous debts and burdens, but also the recognition that it is our children in many ways who are paying this price and will pay that price into the future. So we have 2 children. One is already in Melbourne, the same daughter I brought here nearly 20 years ago. The other one is going to China in a couple of months' time. And that would be the normal currency of a conversation that you would have in Cork nowadays with almost any colleague. There is no part of the extended family of any of us that doesn't have our own children or cousins or nephews and nieces leaving. There's the question of whether this is an act of God or mismanagement, and I'll kind of come back to that. We have the sort of political tendency just to sort of dismiss the responsibility of the political elite for what has actually befallen us, and it's presented often as something which it just happens. These things happen. It's not really our responsibility. And then we have the sort of key argument around the topic of what sociologists now are starting to call choice or constraint. In a word, if people are leaving the country, are they leaving because they have to or because they want to? So you have the distinction there between emigration as what is dismissively referred to quite often nowadays as a lifestyle choice, or emigration as a kind of an involuntary or forced departure. And obviously the ways in which one sees those differ greatly according to which point of view you take. And then there's the question of who's omitted from the picture, and I think it's kind of worth dwelling on this as well, because when we talk about immigration, we do see it as a story of oppression and victimhood and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of people that are left out of that narrative, and I think that's important to underline as well. So again, looking at the southern traditions there, for instance, the fact is that the depletion of the Protestant population between 1921 and 1936 was absolutely enormous. And yet, until quite recently, it wasn't even talked about. There's not much research done on it. I can think of some good scholarship being done now. But it was part of the project of the Free State to characterise people up here as being the ones who were sectarian. We were not. And we chose not to address some of the things which were done, and indeed some of the boycotts and indeed in certain cases murders and other acts of intimidation and violence which characterised the early days of the Free State. So that became a taboo subject. But on the other side, equally, if you take, for instance, the Civil War, which occurred in 1922-23, many Republicans, in other words, the losing side during the Civil War, were also forced out of the country. And again, that was also a topic that was not discussed until the fairly recent past. There is very good scholarship on it now. The recent issue of Éire Ireland, for instance, the Irish Studies Journal, has a very good article by Gavin Foster, who is a young historian in Montreal in Canada, on Republicans leaving after the Civil War. So again, I mean, in certain respects, emigration becomes the way in which the excluded are dealt with. Once they're gone, they are forgotten, as Boland says in her poem. And in more recent times, one can think of other examples of what you might call emigration as a form of forced social exclusion. So the unmarried mothers who had to leave because of what was seen as sexually deviant behaviour, for which the women themselves were frequently blamed, were part of that forgotten exodus. There was the classed nature of emigration, so by and large it was disproportionately the poor who left, the uneducated, the disadvantaged. And then more recently even, I remember talking to one student in the early 1990s now, and she wanted to study the impact of HIV, AIDS on young people in the Cork region, and when she actually started doing her research she discovered she couldn't pursue the matter. Why? For the simple reason that for many people in Ireland at the time who were diagnosed as HIV, their first reaction was to get the boat or the plane to London, which was an extraordinary comment on a society, that you leave your home place because you do not feel that you can live in that society with something which would have the sort of tainted quality that being HIV positive would have. So there are all those traditions, not to mention, for instance, I did my own research in Piaras in the 1980s, and one of the things I was surprised by was the number of gay and lesbian Irish people I met over there who said they didn't leave for economic reasons. They left because they didn't feel that Irish society was sufficiently tolerant for people like them. And for them, ironically, often the trigger for that departure was the 1986 divorce referendum down south, which was lost. It was subsequently adopted in the late 1990s. So for them, even though the question of marriage and divorce didn't arise, it was kind of the last straw as a signal of a society that would not really embrace all the different members of that society, whether for religious or matters of sexual orientation or other reasons, did not feel part of the mainstream. So I think we should recognise that in any attempt to address immigration, we need to address all the different strands and all the different motivations, and sort of put back into the picture the many different minorities who have been disproportionately the ones who did emigrate at different times. So let's look at some of these myths and narratives. I mean, the obvious one, first of all, is, and I've touched on this already, the whole notion of emigration as exile. The American wake, departure was like a death. When we had an American wake, until the modern period anyway, until say the 1960s onwards, you weren't expected to come back. So it was like a debt to the family, a debt to the community. And probably Kirby Miller's book had a very key influence, and indeed the title is a giveaway, Emigrants and Exiles, Ireland and the Irish Exodus to North America. For Miller, the exile is always defined by his or her relationship to the country that he or she has left. So it's the backward look, the desire to return, all of that kind of notion embodied in the very word diaspora. The emigrant, by contrast, kind of strides forward into a confident future in this new place, if you like, without looking back. And that's putting it in slightly simplistic black and white terms, but that's the kind of idea which is embodied. And again, Miller discusses the book I've mentioned already, John Mitchell, The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps, and he talks about the way in which Mitchell characterised the process of emigration after the famine. There began to be an eager desire in England to get rid of the Celts by emigration, for though they were perishing fast of hunger and typhus, they were not perishing fast enough. So the idea there was if you couldn't kill them, you could force them out. Now, again, I'm saying this is a characterisation of Irish history with which some of you may agree and others will not. But the important point is it becomes part of a narrative that people tell themselves, and it has a certain explanatory power, even though it involves, in a certain sense, the distortion of history as well. And I suppose one of my arguments would be that in modern times, this view of emigration as victimhood and exile has an extraordinary power, an extraordinary emotional resonance, which is still with us today, and which is one of the reasons why when you read, say, the Southern papers in particular, you're going to see these kind of themes returning again and again and again, with extraordinary sort of resilience, as I say. So if we want to understand emigration, I suppose talking more from my sort of Cork perspective, let's look at different factors. Cultural factors would be one, and in a sense I've just been talking about this, the historically embedded tradition of emigration as a formative element in how we think about it. Geographical factors, we've always had the next door labour market to us in which we and they speak more or less the same language. And that's a very important point, and it's interesting, for instance, that again it doesn't fit with the myth. I mean, the myth is still a dream of America, even right down to the present day, and yet the reality has been that throughout the 20th century most Irish emigrants actually went next door. They went to Britain, and that may also have some connection with the process of denial. We didn't like to admit necessarily that our former old enemy, as it were, was the country which also hosted the greatest number of our immigrants when they did have to leave. Social factors, and I'll just touch on this very briefly because I could give another paper on just this one, but I've been looking at a comparative approach to current European migration, and there are some intriguing differences which have arisen. I've got a colleague in Zaragoza in Spain who spent some time last summer with us in Cork, and she was looking at emigration out of Spain at the moment and emigration out of Ireland, and she found that even after you took into account the fact that we have this labour market next door where they speak the same language, etc., 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 that by and large Spanish people are much, much, much less likely to emigrate, even in very difficult times, and they're experiencing such times at the moment, far worse than we are. They don't go, and we do. Part of this is that historically embedded tradition I've mentioned. Part is the aforementioned labour market, but there's something else happening as well there that bears thinking about. And it seems, for instance, in the Spanish case, one possible explanation, though cynics say it's the weather, one possible explanation is that the extended family in Spain still plays a very strong role in people's kind of social formation and behaviour. So if the son or the daughter in Madrid is unemployed, temporarily or on a longer basis, the parents living somewhere else in the country will be paying their rent for them. There's a much greater degree of intergenerational solidarity within the extended family. And it seems that in Ireland at the moment we have lost much of this tradition. So it's interesting that while we're often called the Latins of the North and various other such cliches, in effect there's considerable difference between the ways in which people in Mediterranean countries behave, because the evidence from Greece is the same, and the ways in which people in Ireland are behaving. What that says about the atomization of our society, the lack of contact and support between generations and so on, is a task for a sociologist, and I'm not. But I just pointed up as an interesting kind of difference. Economic factors are something else, I think, which are important. And again, that's, I think, an area where there is a distinction between the current generation and previous Irish generations. Because in previous Irish generations, we were the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. We were the ones who went abroad with disproportionately uneducated emigrants. Damien Hannon, for instance, did a famous piece of work called Rural Exodus, which was published in 1970, and most of his research was done in the early 1960s. And he points out that the vast majority of Irish emigrants at the time, and I think this would not have been quite as true in the north, but certainly was in the south, had no better level of education than a primary certificate. So they were the ones who went and did the work in other societies that other people didn't want to do. And what you see by contrast in the 1970s through to the present period is a huge change in the educational system, and at the same time you see something else kicking in, which is the process of globalisation. So with globalisation, for instance, whereas in the 1950s the Irish building worker, construction worker, was king of that domain on British building sites. They were the major contribution to those building sites. Nowadays the Irish building worker going to London is actually competing with people from all over Europe and beyond in an industry where, if you like, there's a race to the bottom, where conditions of work, wage levels and so forth are actually in relative terms far less attractive now than they would have been 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago to Irish migrant workers then. So in that sense, it's a different kind of challenge now. And you could say that in the modern world, because of globalisation, you have a kind of a two-tier market. The well-educated immigrant nowadays has the world at her feet. You can go to China, you can go to Australia, you can go to any one of 27 countries within the European Union. You have a world of opportunity. That means if you do have to leave, you're not going to be leaving on a cattle boat. And you're probably going to do better and experience better opportunities and more exciting career prospects and so forth in other countries than you did. But the other reality is that there are still many people leaving who don't have the advantages of, let us say, for instance, a third level education, who maybe don't have the languages they need, and who are now competing in conditions which, if anything, are tougher than they were half a century ago. And that again is something which is often forgotten in public debates. Psychological factors then, guilt, denial and victimhood. I've touched on those already and I'll come back to them again. Here's a headline, for instance, from the Financial Times of July of last year. The Portuguese Prime Minister tells the unemployed to look abroad. And the only reason I'm showing that headline is because I can't imagine seeing a headline tomorrow in the Irish Times or any other organ of repute, either in Dublin or in Belfast for that matter, where it says, the First Deputy or the Taoiseach tells the Irish, northern or southern, unemployed to look abroad. It would be seen as, in terms of the traditions which I've been describing, an unacceptable thing to say. It caused an awful row in Portugal as well, I should say, but I'm just drawing your attention to it because it's interesting why it kind of illustrates that difference. So when we look at emigration in Ireland, we have the two discourses, and I'm going to outline emigration levels similar to the 1980s. So and you'll see these kinds of headlines and these kinds of stories on a daily and weekly basis in the Dublin and Cork media. You will not see them to the same extent here. So it does have that more central role down south than it does up here. Over 100,000 Irish workers expected to leave the country before 2012. This is from The Guardian 2 years ago. And again, that image, it's an interesting image. Some of you may recognise it because it is reproduced so often. It's from Euston Station in the 1950s. And this is a woman from a Catholic charitable agency greeting a girl who's just off the train, having travelled on the boat. Of course, the idea there was that people might fall into various kinds of vice unless they were guided on their way when they arrived in this new country. And much of the debate in the 1950s was about godless England and Catholic Ireland and the dangers that might befall women migrants in particular. And there were even proposals in some parts of the Catholic Church that emigration should actually be banned. And incidentally, the Portuguese government did that under Salazar for a number of decades. It didn't work very much, but that's what they tried to do. So that image, again, what I'm trying to say here is that these images and these kind of narratives surface again and again, even though they may not, in fact, be fully appropriate for an understanding of what is happening nowadays. But they still have this extraordinary power in public and popular discourse. Again, 1,000 people a week leaving Ireland, it's kind of a nice round number. Is it accurate? Not necessarily. It certainly doesn't tell us the whole story. Here we have from the Sunday Independent recently, the Irish Independent, goodbye has once more become the most melancholy word in our lexicon. So you have that whole image the tragedy of emigration, the emotive power of the image, and again, I'm not being in any way dismissive of it. I'm simply trying to illustrate it as one of the narratives. There's another one that I touched on a moment ago, guilt. And this is interesting too, because there is a tendency as well to blame the emigrants themselves. This is from De Valera back in 1951. Emigration should be recognised by everybody as having reached alarming dimensions. I've been at some pains, he said, to secure the most reliable estimates indicating the trends in recent years. The best figures which I've been able to get indicate that net emigration, which was 10,000 in 1947, went up to 28,000 and so on. And then he goes on to say, the saddest part of all of this is that work is available at home and in conditions infinitely better from the point of view both of health and morals. Now, I won't read out the whole quotation, but let me just say briefly, this is absolute rubbish. I mean, you know, and everybody hearing that will have known this. But again, what's behind this is that sort of the tendency to blame the emigrant herself or himself for leaving this new state and, as it were, abandoning it. And here we have, this week, in the Irish Times, this is yesterday's Irish Times, Friday, February the 1st, are emigrants abandoning Ireland, or has it abandoned them? So it hasn't gone away, you know, to coin a phrase, this way of thinking about emigration. It shows the very complex emotions that we have when it comes to just thinking about this topic. And here again, this is I find this a very powerful and indeed touching photograph, because you don't often see men embracing in Irish airports. But again, this kind of photograph, you will see this in spades every single Christmas. This is Saying Goodbye After Christmas Holidays by Kate Horgan. It was actually taken several years back. It's not a new photograph. But it's, again, it embodies the ways in which we think about emigration as tragic, as sort of sundering families and all of that. And again, having, as it were, been there, I know what the effect is. More professionals could emigrate. 3/4 of professionals would leave Ireland within 3 years. So you have a whole sort of, I suppose, catastrophe narrative concerning emigration, which connects directly and links all the way back to the 19th century. That's really what I'm trying to say, and I'm arguing that such a narrative has no real equivalent, I think, here. I'm hoping somebody might contradict me. Now, there's the other point of view then, which says, well, nothing to do with us, and this is the neoliberal perspective. Mr. Geary, the director of the Central Statistics Office down south, said back in 1951, it's a gross oversimplification to suggest that emigration is due solely or even principally to lack of economic development in Ireland. Again, he's in denial too. And if we look, well, I won't, yeah, will I mention Alexis Fitzgerald? I will. Report of the Commission for Emigration and Other Population Questions, the most famous single report ever published in the South on emigration. And here is Alexis Fitzgerald in his admittedly minority or dissenting view. I cannot accept the view that a high rate of emigration is necessarily a sign of national decline, or that policy should be over-anxiously framed to reduce it. In order of values, it seems more important to preserve and improve the quality of Irish life than it is to reduce the numbers of Irish emigrants. High emigration, granted a population excess, releases social tensions which would otherwise explode and makes possible a stability of life, manners and customs that would otherwise be the subject of radical change. So the middle classes will protect themselves, thank you very much, and they will put up the drawbridge, and the rest can just leave. And that clearly was the message, and to some extent I would argue that's still the message today. Here we have Brian Lenihan, another very famous quotation from 1987, the last major wave. What we have now is a very literate emigrant who thinks nothing of coming to the US and going back to Ireland and maybe on to Germany and back to Ireland again. It's all one nice merry-go-round. The world is now one world, and they can always return to Ireland with the skills they have developed. We regard them as part of a global generation of Irish people. We shouldn't be defeatist or pessimistic about it. We should be proud of it. After all, we can't all live on a small island. And this made so many people so angry, it became an anthem for a generation. I remember marches with the banner, "We can't all live on a small island," being held up in Dublin and Galway and Cork. And here we have, much more recently, Mary Coughlin. Nobody remembers her now. She was Taoiseach, or Deputy Prime Minister, in the last Fianna Fáil government. The type of people who've left, some of them find they want to enjoy themselves, and that's what young people are entitled to do. Moreover, they're coming with different talents, they're coming with degrees, PhDs, they have a greater acumen academically, and they've found work in other parts of the world, and that's not a bad thing. So emigration is not a problem. It's good, everybody gains, and then they come back with their skills. Here's Martin Manzer, another Fianna Fáil politician. I have a daughter, he says, who spoke in her teenage years of emigration, but she is working in Ireland. These teens go around in cycles. So this is the emigration as act of God idea, nothing to do with governments. It just happens, and we should get used to it. And here's Michael Noonan, who's still our present Minister for Finance, and he branded emigration a lifestyle choice. And again, he was criticised for that. And here's a survey done last year by the Irish Times, the only single large-scale poll And we have the headline. Admittedly, the headline is not the journalist's fault, it's the sub-editor's fault, but the headline is "Immigrants Leaving by Choice, Not Necessity." So again, is it constraint or is it choice? And then we have the whole sort of growth of new websites like this one. This is the Irish Times Generation Emigration. And again, there are hundreds of contributions on that. It's worth looking at for anybody interested in the topic. You'll find something from me from about 3 days back, but there are all kinds of different views expressed on it. Now, so those are the discourses. It's a very central aspect of Southern thinking. It touches the very notion of how we think about ourselves, our future, our identity, the way in which the state is managed. It has that kind of central role that, as I've been arguing, it doesn't have maybe in other jurisdictions. Let's look at some of the realities. And I'll have I got about 10 minutes, Brian? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I want to move from, as it were, narratives and myths to, and I don't mean myths, again, in anything other than technical sense. I'm not sort of insulting any of these different points of view. I'm simply illustrating them. But to move them from what's actually happening, and just to talk about that very briefly. I mean, first of all, immigration from the south is comparable roughly to the 1980s and the 1950s. So, I mean, in a certain sense, it is as serious a problem now, or a challenge, let's say, as it was then. It's not completely the same, though. For instance, between 1986 and 2006, the labour force in the south actually doubled, roughly from about 1 million to about 2 million. So we got some things right as well in the southern economy. That level of growth, which took off in the mid-1990s, was not foreseen in the report on immigration of 1991. In other words, we had a very bad 1980s. By 1991, we were saying we see no prospect of any improvement, and yet we had. And I'm just saying that by way of recognising that without having a crystal ball, we may yet actually come out of our present crisis. It's not looking good right now, but judging by the experience of the 1980s, we shouldn't write off that possibility either. We may yet kind of come out of it and resume the sort of growth process which will enable people to stay at home. But right now it's not looking good, and we have unemployment of 14.5%, which would certainly be several points higher if it were not for immigration. And again, that doesn't have a parallel in this part of the country. Return migration has always been a feature of Irish mobility, even as far back as the 1930s. About half those who left in the 80s subsequently returned, but the propensity to return is strongly differentiated by age and class. So we tend to forget about return migration, and yet people keep coming back. Now, the thing about the 80s that's interesting is that in the 1990s we had this phenomenal growth rate in the country. 1997, 1998, 1999, the growth rate was of the order of 8%. I mean, that's more than 4 times higher than what would be regarded as a normal type of growth rate. And even then, when things were at their most favourable, only about half those who had left actually chose to come back. That's a significant figure. That gives us some kind of a guideline for the future. It's not a lost generation, but many of those leaving now will not return. And we can say two further things. If you do well abroad, you're actually more likely to return home. That's one thing. It may seem paradoxical. And the second thing is that, and again this is stating the obvious, the longer you stay abroad, the less likely that you will come back. So by the time you're in your mid-30s, you're probably established somewhere else. You may have a spouse, children in school, a developing professional career, a circle of friends. The chances that you return after that age are greatly diminished. So the message for us here, for instance, is if we don't do something about the southern economy in the next 4, 5, 6 years, then the chances that that will be a lost generation grow exponentially after that. And that's something which the planners need to bear in mind. One thing that has changed, I think, and I mentioned this already, the socially vulnerable. People don't leave Ireland now because their sexual orientation is unacceptable. I think in terms, say, of gay rights and so forth, we've seen a lot of progress. Single parenthood is not an issue. There isn't the same stigma attached to people because they have children out of marriage or whatever. So those kinds of factors have changed. Ireland is now itself a much more diverse and largely a more liberal society, I think largely for the better. So those themselves no longer constitute reasons for leaving. I think that's probably a good thing. On the other hand, we still have a considerable level of underperformance in the Irish primary and second level education systems, and we have problems with levels of literacy. And there are still vulnerable people emigrating who are going to find it extremely tough in, as I say, globalised labour markets where unless you have skills, you are not going to prosper. And that continues to be an issue. And the iconic example of that is the construction industry. I have a graph of that in a moment. Further challenges, we've had a major shrinkage in the Irish public sector. I think something you are experiencing to some extent, but not to quite the same scale in Northern Ireland. We're seeing the collapse of our health system. We're seeing a complete block on recruitment, almost complete anyway in the university system. The civil service is not recruiting. Army and Guards and so forth are not recruiting on the level they used to. So those are all areas, medicine, those are areas where the traditional outlets, for instance, for well-educated graduates are very much attenuated compared to what they would have been before. Certain professions which would have done well in the boom years are not doing well now, and the obvious example I've given there are architects. And then we have other differences as well of substance, and construction I've already mentioned, and the other point to mention is the United States. That did become a default option for a significant minority of Irish immigrants in the 1980s. And we had the Morrison visas, the Donnelly visas, various ways in which they ultimately became regularised. There is a major question mark. I know that there has been an announcement this week by Barack Obama about immigration reform, and that will probably be based on, they won't call it an amnesty, they'll probably call it something like regularisation. You'll pay a fee of some kind, you'll wait for several years, and ultimately you may get a green card. It's not going to benefit people who are not already in the States. And there are not as many Irish undocumented in the States now as there were back in the 80s. Why? Because after 9/11, it became far more difficult to get in and much more difficult to live in American society. People are doing it, but if you can't even get a driver's license, it's a very difficult challenge, and you certainly can't leave the States to come back for, let's say, a relative's funeral here without risking not being able to get back in. So there are people living these twilight lives, but they're not more than a small minority of today's immigrants, and it's unlikely that any immigration reform will open the doors towards greater levels of immigration to the States. If we look at the gross figures, and this is just to give you an idea of the sheer scale, and you can sort of, in your own mind, kind of figure what this might mean if it happened here, which it isn't happening. Gross out-migration for the most recent year, and that's the year finishing at the end of March 2012, so these are very up-to-date statistics. And incidentally, the statistics are not as up-to-date or kept as regularly for the Northern Ireland case, and I know that Joanne can tell me a bit about this, but it's interesting in itself that we obsessively keep statistics about migration. It shows again how central it still is. So in that year, ending March of 2012, 87,000 people left. And people say, well, that's just as bad as the 1980s and 1950s. It's a bit different though, because of those 87,000, 46,000 were Irish. And I'm not saying in any sense it's not a tragedy for others who had made their lives to have to go away as well. But many of those migrants, the ones who are not Irish, are actually people from, let's say, Central and Eastern Europe who are returning to their own countries or moving on. So it's not quite the same as the scale of immigration which happened back in the 1980s. So you have the figures there. And then net migration is a good deal lower. This is something we don't often remember. I mean, gross out migration, so 87,000. But even in the worst of times, there are still people coming back for a variety of reasons. It may be because they've got work here. It may be because they have elderly relatives to look after. There's always a toing and froing of migrants. Even in the good times, people leave. So back in the Celtic Tiger years from the south, there were up to 26,000 people leaving every year. And even in the bad times, people come back. So it's a more complex story than what we read in the public media, and that's not often recognised. Voluntary migration occurs at all times, but it's fair to see the present numbers as including large numbers of involuntary migrants. So if the numbers of people, say, who are Irish who are leaving now is twice what it was 10 years ago, it's a fair guess that that other half who are now leaving would not have left if we had not had this economic collapse, and there's no point ignoring that. Lots of figures for Australia. These are the numbers, for instance, of people going on Australian visas, and it's gone up from 11,000 in 2002 to 21,000 in 2011. But the point to make there is that those are temporary working holiday visas. You get 12 months, extendable by a further 12 months, 2 years max, and then you're out again. And living in Australia under the radar is really not possible, virtually impossible. So just as Irish people are leaving for Australia now in large numbers, it's become the new America. But in fact, the conditions under which you can get permanent residence there are extremely limited. So it's not some kind of a magic solution, even though everyone is talking about it. These are the figures for people getting permanent status in Australia. And we can see that, for instance, in 2010, 2011, for Ireland, the figure is only 1,319. So you have 20,000 plus people going there on temporary visas, but not much more than 1,000 getting the right to remain there on a longer term basis. So Australia is not going to solve our problems. These are the figures for Britain, and again, 2011, these are people signing on for national insurance, and that's the best measure of people going to work in Britain. So you're looking at, again, 16,000, that kind of number going to Britain every year. Here's the trend, looking at men and women, and again, you can see there is an upward trend. But again, it's not that dramatic. 2002, 2008, you're looking at sort of between 8 and 10,000. It's gone up now to more than 16,000. So yes, there is an upward trend, but probably not on the kind of cosmic scale which we're getting in media reports of Irish migration. I'm not saying that in any way to minimise the reality of emigration. Again, here's construction. This one is interesting. You don't have to take all that in, but just look at the two lines which are falling towards the right of the screen, the blue one and the red one. Those are Ireland and Spain. And that's construction. And if we look at Ireland and Spain and we look at construction, the number of males involved in construction.
It's all right.
So the number of
breach of the local library regulation.
Illegal migrants.
Well, I'm nearly finished, so maybe there's a hint being said to be there. If we look at the number of people in construction in 2007 in Spain and Ireland, 26% of all males, it's the same figure for both countries, were involved directly in construction. That was absolutely not sustainable. In a typical normal economy, the number of males involved in construction is somewhere between 10 and 12%. That's the figure you'll get across Western Europe. So we know that there was a bubble in Ireland and a bubble in Spain. As it happens, a very comparable bubble, and in both cases it's collapsed. And in both cases you see the result. You see the drop in the percentage of people employed. By the way, it says 13% there because when I say 26%, that was males. But of all working population, 13% in Spain and Ireland were the ones in construction, and they have paid the highest price. Those two industries in Ireland and in Spain have absolutely collapsed. So what's happening in Ireland is not unique. The bubble of speculation and property development occurred in other countries as well. So just trying to draw a few conclusions, and I will really stop in a minute or two. So I just want to talk a little bit about continuity and change. We've had a huge switch in Ireland from rural to urban. If you actually look at the structure of the southern population now, compared to 50 years ago, the vast majority of Irish people now live in cities. The largest, Leinster and the Dublin conurbation, have absorbed more of the population than anywhere else. So well over 40% of the population live in the greater Dublin area. The population now of the west and northwest, and indeed the southwest, is extremely sparse by comparison. So that's a big change from the traditional idea of the Irish emigrant as being rural and poor. We're not the hewers of wood and drawers of water any longer. The education revolution has meant that Irish emigrants today are highly skilled, highly educated. We have the highest level of third level education in the European Union. It's 48%. The British figure by comparison is 46%. So that's a revolution as well, and that's a major change. The impact of globalisation I've touched on. It is now tougher for people without skills to compete in global labour markets and in globalised cities like London. Again, one small example, building workers in Ireland without skills, in other words, without an apprenticeship, back in 2007 were making between 26 and 28 euro per hour on site. A lot of money. The same people in London at the moment might expect to get 11 or 12 pounds sterling. That's in relative terms, and for a very expensive city, a much tougher way to make a living. And then return, I mean, what's been called the Ryanair generation. The reality of emigration now is it's not something you just capture as a permanent decision and a permanent move. It's really part of a cycle of comings and goings in which that kind of fluidity is much more characteristic of emigration today. So greater mobility, high-end employment. If you're in accountancy or something nowadays, you can expect to work around the world. It's become part of that kind of transnational activity, and most third-level graduates can expect to do that at parts of their working lives in the future. Again, that raises the question for education of who pays, and that's a big debate we're having down south at the moment. It's more difficult to predict future scenarios for those doing less skilled work because of the factors I mentioned, like globalisation. Migration and mobility needs to be seen in the context of a life cycle, so it's not that single departure forever and ever. It's something which will be much more fluid in the future, a lot more people coming and going with the passing years. So, I mean, just in conclusion, when we talk about emigration, we don't need the kind of crude and sometimes too embedded in the past kind of ideas. On the one hand, the lifestyle choice. On the other hand, emigration as tragedy, if you like, the coffin ship. We need something which is much more fine-grained and which addresses, above all, the differential and class-based likely experiences and expectations of Irish migrants. If you're well educated nowadays, you're going to do well wherever you go. If you're not, you'll be at a disadvantage because of globalisation. So in a modern, highly globalised labour economy, there are winners and losers in a more fluid, dynamic and unpredictable world of migratory stocks and flows, and we see that as well with people from other parts of the world much more than we do. The Filipinos who are coming to this country, for instance. I suggest that none of the existing dominant discourses whereby such processes are narrated in popular and political terms in Ireland fully capture the complexity and indeed inequalities of such movements of people, including Irish migrants, in an age of crisis and change. And I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Now, we have a conch, so just be aware that we are recording this. So bear that in mind when you make your comments. Joanne, come on then.
We want to record your dulcet words.
My dulcet words. Piaras, thank you very much for a really brilliant talk, and just absolutely, for me, completely and utterly fascinating. You did say, however, that you hoped that someone would contradict you, and I volunteered to be that person, but just in a very minor point.
I never doubted you, Joanne.
I knew you expected nothing less. But interesting that you mentioned about the current discourse and what's happening. A year ago, on January 31st, as a matter of fact, BBC Northern Ireland broadcast a documentary, a little sort of programme called The Lost Generation. So what's interesting is that I wrote a piece for the Telegraph, asked me to write a piece on after that, because they were concerned about this lost generation discourse, which has, I think, somehow been spread from the south as well. The figures are there, Piaras, are not very good, but we know that, for example, that we have a high youth unemployment, we have high youth emigration at the moment. BBC Northern Ireland contacted me again in December because they're doing a 3-part series. It's going to be on this month about interviews with young people and some people who have already emigrated and so on. So this has really entered the discourse, this idea of a lost generation. My point was that in actual fact we've had several lost generations here in Northern Ireland, but they were greeted with almost complete and utter silence, especially on part of the politicians. Partly this was in the 1920s and 30s because of this idea of a failed state, which actually we have our own parallel narrative of state failure that's happening at the same time in the 20s and 30s. And then, you know, one of the things was that the southern immigration that was higher, nevertheless it was still higher per capita than it was here per person, allowed politicians, I argue, to just dismiss northern immigration, because they'd say, Terence O'Neill in 1962, when the 1961 census results were released, you know, which was a terrible shock to the Northern Irish population, to almost 100,000 people were missing. 92,000 people were mysteriously should have been here and were not. And he greeted that with the fact that, well, don't worry about it, because down south they have much higher emigration than we do. And the other thing that he blamed it on, interestingly, was television. And he said that which, as you may recall, was very new at that point. He said his argument was that the very nice portrayal of urban life, particularly in British cities, had attracted people, particularly from the rural areas, to abandon the wonderful life in rural Northern Ireland and head to these decadent places. So that was an interesting thing. So it's interesting that I think there have been parallel discourses. I think they've been silenced here. But now, because it's the middle class, the children of the middle class who are leaving, that's my argument. I think that it's that lost generation thing is now an actual phrase that's being bandied about up here quite a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I mean, we blame television for something else in the South, because a famous Irish politician, Oliver J. Flanagan, used to say there was no sex in Ireland before television. Yes, in a sense it was true, as Pat here says. I mean, I wonder, is that sort of almost a kind of leakage of the discourse from the South in here? But equally, I mean, it is true that there has been a rise in middle-class immigration, if you measure in terms of social class and education attainment. But that's partly because now, both North and South, a much higher percentage of the population in general would be kind of technically middle class in those senses. So I'm not sure whether that's had an impact as well.
I do think it is leakage from the South to some extent, but it is also a reality here,
yeah.
Because we've seen what the latest figures are. And we have now a turnaround in emigration hugely since 2010.
Yeah, but your point about the 60s and 50s is interesting too, because I mean you had the same discourse down south. I mean, De Valera's famous 1943 speech, which I'm sure you all know about, the Ireland that we dreamed of, paints this kind of bucolic image of the comely lasses and the sturdy youths and all of that, very famous image. And in fact, you know, the comely lasses and the sturdy youths were on the streets of Birmingham and London working damned hard for a living. So there was a kind of denial down south as well. I think in the case of Northern Ireland there might have been a more specific kind of denial, that in this perfect unionist state which had chosen to remain within the United Kingdom instead of the southern one, nothing like that could possibly be happening. So there was a different kind of denial maybe.
Very different kind. But parallel in a strange way.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. Now I'm looking for Margaret Mellon.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Enjoy the lecture very much. No, I just wondered too, is there a little bit of the moral discourse which we have had here, particularly around the supposed loss of middle class, moderate unionist leadership, is that people abandon the working class and they go away and they get educated in England, Scotland, and they stay there and they don't come back. And I had an example of this sort of being reawakened recently with somebody, I live in East Belfast, somebody exasperatingly, a neighbour who has 3 boys at university age, saying, you know, I've been telling them to try and get jobs here, to stay here, but now, you know, when I see this, they may as well just go, I'll tell them to go. So there is a kind of a feeling that, you know, people should be toughing it out and doing their bit, but in fact that usually the choice is the other way, that they move both geographically away from the working class and from their leadership roles. And
so is there a sense that by emigration they're committing a kind of act of disloyalty to their own community, or is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there has been a discussion as to the fact that personally they don't feel that. They feel they have the freedom to choose. As you mentioned, the fact they are UK citizens, and therefore they feel that it's perfectly okay to be working in London or wherever. But and there may be a sense of abandoning any sense of an Northern Irish identity. But I think that there has been the discussion, if it's a discourse at all in the wider community, is the fact, well, during the Troubles, Catholic people went into West Belfast, you know, when they could have left, and that they stayed with their communities. And Protestants didn't do that, and that's partly why the working class now feel leaderless and beleaguered.
I mean, that sort of relates as well to the whole question of the rise, in particular in Protestant out-migration from Northern Ireland in the 1970s and onwards. And again, I've always wondered why that was stronger than the equivalent on the, if one can, I shouldn't use these terms in such a broad brush way, but on the nationalist or Catholic side, emigration was not as strong.
No, but it is partly the business of being educated.
Yeah.
That's where, I mean, the street that I lived in when my children were growing up, I can't think of a single child other than one of my daughters who's still here. So that's one thing. The other minor point, maybe you talked about sexuality. One of the things in the north that I think triggered emigration, particularly during the Troubles, was mixed relationships, what we would call mixed marriages.
Yeah.
Gentleman over here and then Paddy.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. You mentioned the comparison between Spain and Ireland. I wonder, on the extended family, which we've almost lost in Northern Ireland, or in Ireland North and South, did the government take over much of the responsibilities that the extended family used to have in Ireland, where the government paid good unemployment benefits, like whatever? Did that take over, do you think?
And that's a very good question, and I think I don't know what the easy answer will be, because in a sense we don't have the research. Certainly, sort of intergenerational solidarity within the extended family does seem to be far stronger in Italy, Spain, and Greece. Has the government taken over here? I don't really see the evidence, but on the other hand, what does seem to emerge here, and we haven't fully explored it yet. We've got a research project that we've just started. In fact, 2 of my colleagues are calling door to door today in Greystones in Wicklow and in Cork. Is there a difference by class between how people behave? I mean, there's some evidence that within working class communities there still is something of a residual extended family bond, making it less likely that they will leave now. Whereas the middle classes, if anything, seem more likely than ever to go. And it's not seen in the same kind of tragic or disastrous terms that it would have been in the past. So that might be a sea change. The role of the state, I'm less sure about. I don't know enough about it, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, I know you mentioned it a bit earlier on, but do you think there's a major emphasis on if your face fits, your face fits, if, for example, you have relations or high up in, GAA or Orange Order, what have you, nepotism exists, that you've got a better chance of securing employment over here, whilst in England you go over, there's more emphasis on merit, you get the job purely because of your own skills, sort of tribalism to a certain extent.
I think historically that certainly was true, absolutely. There were networks of inclusion which also excluded other people. I mean, I had a friend, he's a retired lecturer from Limerick, and he used to say if you'd gone to a certain school there and you were bright, you automatically went to the local university, which in those days was Cork. And if you weren't bright, they found you a job with the Limerick Harbour Commissioners. In other words, there were always these circles. I think what changed that in Ireland, though, from the 60s onwards, was the presence of foreign direct investment and the development of a major multinational sector. If you're working for Apple or Motorola, or the people who make Viagra down in Cork, who are they? Pfizer's, yeah. They don't care who your father or mother was. I think it still exists in certain sectors, and the one I would single out is the primary education sector, where to get a job in a primary school you really have to have what we still call pull. But I think in a more general sense it's a lot less prevalent than it used to be in the south. I wouldn't like to say, though, it has vanished entirely. Yeah.
I was very impressed with your overview of the situation. I am one of those who emigrated in the 80s. I came north. From the south. I'd actually been working in Roscrea at the time, and I came to Omagh. And I am also a returned migrant because I went back south in 2007. And one of the things that struck me is that we don't see the cross-border movements here as, do we, as migration? I was conscious of it when I came north, and I used to joke about taking the Queen's shilling, coming north at the time, because I worked in the public sector here.
But did you see yourself as an immigrant?
To some extent, yes.
Yeah.
And I felt I was in a different community. Northern Ireland is different. Living in Northern Ireland is different to living in the Republic of Ireland. And I found that when I came here, and I found that when I went back. Now, going back to live and going up and down on a regular basis are two different things. But what marked it out for much of the time I was here was the fact that the border was not sealed, but was guarded. And it was only gradually that broke down. And it has gone now. You don't notice it as you cross to the same extent between one jurisdiction and the other. The other thing that struck me, and I still go back and forth because I have family here in Omagh still, that struck me about it is the degree to which, certainly in urban areas in the south, it's a much more multicultural society than it is in Northern Ireland. Omagh is still essentially a white Northern Irish place. Castlebar, where I now live, is largely that, but it is also very much, you hear Polish, Russian, and you see a fair number of Africans around as well. So it is a very, and this is sort of rural west of Ireland, a small town in the west of Ireland. And you have emerging, it strikes me, very different societies. Yes, Northern Ireland is changing. There is in-migration also, but it is not in the same order, it strikes me, as it is down south. And when you talk, particularly when you were talking there at the end about sort of the out-migration and the numbers, and the fact that part of that is return or onward migration of non-Irish people, there is the issue of, when we look at it in those ways, are we excluding those who are coming into Ireland and settling and becoming citizens, and I speak specifically of down south, it has struck me, and it's something that I've been very aware of and something that we've been working on. I work in the Museum of Country Life in Castlebar, and we've been trying to develop ways of communicating with sort of the immigrants there, as much as looking at migration in the traditional sense, and emigration particularly.
I mean, first of all, I agree with you entirely, and I mean, in fact, my main area of research for the last 15 to 20 years has been immigration rather than emigration, and I think, in a sense, there's a kind of we have a blind spot about this. I mean, if you take, say, Irish undocumented in the United States, and you take politicians like, in your case, Michael Ring, West Mayo, when he talks about regularising the Irish, he never makes the connection with the situation of migrants here in Ireland, north or south, legal or illegal. There's a complete disconnect mentally between the two realities, even though in many ways the realities are comparable. The people living in the shadows here in Ireland are living lives which in many ways are more challenging than any Irish undocumented in the States, and it seems like we don't want to recognise that. And I'm interested as well what you say about Castlebar, because I mean, again, I've done some work on this. I mean, certainly Dublin and Cork and to some extent Belfast are now multicultural cities, but the real impact of immigration in the last 15 years has actually been on small to mid-sized towns right across rural Ireland, southwest, all parts of it. A place like Fermoy, for instance, in Cork, it would have a migrant population now of somewhere between 15 and 17%. And when you have that number of people coming from other countries into what had previously been a very tight-knit community, that has a massive impact. And in many ways it hasn't gone as badly as one might have expected, but we haven't really begun to address it yet. We don't have any policy about integration. We don't have any policy about whether we want multiculturalism or whether we expect immigrants to assimilate. We have avoided all those debates. So something like, whether girls can wear hijab in secondary school or not, we leave it to the school. We have completely copped out on so many of these kind of fundamental debates that we should have. And I'd have to say I think it's rather similar up here, but the scale of the issue is much more substantial in the south than in the north.
Sorry, I'd just like to ask, what do you think about maybe there's almost a discourse of celebration of emigration? I'm thinking maybe of Tim Pat Coogan and his book on the Wherever Green is One, whatever it's called. And also, maybe more recently, you'll get periodically articles in the press down south about GAA activities in particular across Europe.
That's an interesting question. I mean, we were talking about Tim Pat this morning, and that particular book, I don't know how many of you have read it, could best be described as Tim Pat goes on his holidays, and he travels the world, and he has rather nice dinners with ambassadors in different embassies and so on. I don't think it's a very serious history, with due respect to Tim Pat, whom I know slightly. I think there is part of that celebratory discourse coming from politicians. In a sense, Brian Lenihan's one that I showed you as an example, where they're trying to, if you've got a bug, make it a feature. So, if we are immigrating, well, let's see that as positive and uplifting, and people will come back with extra skills. I do think the GAA, though, is a really fascinating phenomenon. I suppose I'm somewhat favourable, because, you get branches of the GAA now from Ulaanbaatar to Abu Dhabi. There's an Asian Games every year where there are GAA clubs from all over Asia which come together and they play tournaments in places like Hong Kong. The GAA club in Budapest has a 50% membership, Hungarian and Irish, with a few others thrown in. So you have people with names like Attila, on the hurling field. I think it's an absolutely extraordinary phenomenon, and in many ways I would sort of salute the GAA, because here in Ireland as well, they have made huge efforts to be inclusive. The GAA, for instance, has a diversity officer who happens to be a Maori from New Zealand and who grew up in New Zealand, unusually for a New Zealander, playing Gaelic football. I think
his name is not O'Halpine.
What?
His name is not O'Halpine.
No, we have Sean O'Halpine in Cork. So I think the GAA is in many ways emblematic of an Ireland which is changing, but which recognises change. I don't see the GAA clubs in the diaspora, for instance, as what they were, say, when I was in Gaelic Park in the 70s, where there were really places where the Irish went to get away from everybody else. Like what the Irish pub used to be in London at a certain time, it was a refuge from the rest of humanity. Nowadays, like when I did my work in Paris, the Irish pub was a place where you went to meet French and Breton and German and British and other people. So I think there's an important shift there. It's not the GAA itself as just celebrating a kind of narrow nationalism anymore. I think it's also embracing a wider world. The GAA's target, for instance, for the next several years is to get to a point where more than half of their membership is outside Ireland. I think the thinking behind that is really interesting.
Is it almost like the Irish pub, which you find everywhere now?
Well, there was a French Army battalion, for instance, in my time in Paris, which formed a GA club. I don't have an explanation even for all of this. They're not going to rival, the great international sports of soccer or rugby anytime soon. But I think the changing nature of the GA, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, I think it's no longer just about the specificity of place, even though it's still rooted in clubs. And clubs are about local places. I don't think it'll ever lose that, but the clubs, by and large, and I've had several students work on this, are very open to, say, people from minority communities. There's a rising level now of teenage players who are Polish or Chinese. The good example is the Chinese hurler. There was an issue of racism in the Wexford GA last year. The GA needs to deal with this and needs a much tougher policy than it has. But by and large, I think it's a remarkably open organisation. It's gone a long way from its kind of traditional, rather hidebound attitude. I'm old enough to remember the ban. That's unthinkable now.
The biggest thing was letting the army police into
It was, yeah. And now we have the Garda and the PSNI having regular games and so on.
Yeah, no, just in relation to what this man said about the celebratory element, I mean, I think it is presented, the narrative is very glossy and sweet. There's, they're frequently described at the cutting edge of business, IT and science. I mean, a recent, I think it was the Irish Independent, about maybe December, had one of their news review at the weekend. They were all beautiful. There was a beautiful woman on the front
good-looking
cover.
young people.
And, the men were. They were all. There's no emphasis, I think, on mental health issues, alcohol abuse, or homesickness, or anything like that. I think the narrative is presented as classic.
I think I'd go further than that and say there's another narrative as well, which is the subtext, and that's about the Irish being white. There's the sort of thing where people say, well, we weren't responsible for the oppression of African Americans or whatever, that was done by other people, so we can sort of we're the right kind of white. And in the sense that, when you look at international migration nowadays, there are a lot of people moving around the world, more than ever have done before in history, and we're surfing that wave, but we're positioning ourselves rather carefully as kind of elite migrants, unlike the great unwashed. And in many ways we forget our own history and our own roots when we do that, so I agree with you.
Piers, just to say just what a remarkable, predictable, but nonetheless remarkable tour de force that was, and there are probably 101 points that you could pick up on and develop and so on, but maybe informally later. Maybe just two things that would pick up on the conversation that's developed. One of them on the, it's following on from Joanne, that the moderates got out, and I think that is a strong motif in relation to immigration from Northern Ireland post-69, and that in the structurally polarised society, the people who rejected that were largely people who removed, and as well as a physical withdrawal, there was also a withdrawal of those who remained, a kind of migration away from the society itself by not voting and not contributing and not trying to positively influence society in a positive way. On the North-South issue that Tony raised, a piece of interesting research under the MSSC here, I think it was past the point where you were the external examiner, otherwise you'd recognise it, but a guy looked at patterns of movement of sixth formers from the schools in Omagh, and the thing that struck me as being very interesting was the disconnect. The children leaving either the Protestant schools or the Catholic schools, crudely, did not go to universities in the Republic. And that was quite striking for Loreto and the Christian Brothers. Very, very strong. And that went back generationally into the 1950s and beyond. So I just thought that was interesting. But the final thing I wanted to throw in the pot to take us back to immigration, I ripped out of the corner of the Belfast Telegraph during the week this small snippet. It's under the headline, "Bad Publicity to Put Migrants Off." An advertising campaign highlighting the pitfalls of life in the UK
this is Romania.
could be used by the government to put off would-be immigrants from Romania and Bulgaria. The move is believed to be one idea aimed at curbing arrivals from the two newest EU states when temporary restrictions expire in December. Now that is a document one would love to get hold of, where the government itself is drawing attention to the negatives of the society that they have contributed to shaping. Wonderful, for the opposition at election time.
It could be a two-edged sword, of course, if you're also trying to attract the right kind of visitors. But in fact, it's interesting to note, Paddy, that those restrictions on Bulgarians and Romanians were lifted quietly in the summer in the Republic, nothing happened. We're not flooded with Romanians and Bulgarians. I mean, there is a very xenophobic debate at the moment in Britain, not, I think, with any equivalent in either part of this island concerning immigration. And it's interesting, in fact, why it has taken on the amplitude it has over there, and it doesn't really find an echo either side of this island.
Is there anybody feeling they've been excluded from it, not caught my eye, that would like to ask her? Because I think we should. Could I slip in one? I think we'd make one last question, because just following up on the line of questioning that Hugh started and that Mary followed up on, and then we should continue the conversation more informally. But I'd be very interested to know what you think about the whole gathering thing that's happening this year. Observing it from up here in the south, we've got a kind of a divided attitude. The department that we're related to, Culture, Arts and Leisure, is sort of trying to show an interest in it, but the department responsible for tourism up here isn't. It's not very good. And I'm not sure what your perspective from Calvin is at the moment. Is it likely to be a success, the gathering, do you think?
Well, first of all, when it came out first, I suppose I had the same reaction as Gabriel Byrne. And for those who don't know, Gabriel Byrne, the Irish actor who lives in New York now, denounced the whole thing as a shakedown of the Irish diaspora, and of course that generated a good deal of heat. And I think I'm not comfortable with this kind of image in my own mind of plane loads of people coming in who are mostly second generation and beyond visiting Ireland, and the same planes taking today's generation of young immigrants away. But I think in some ways we have to get over that. What I find really astonishing, it is going to be a success, there's no question about that. I mean, there has been an extraordinary community-based set of initiatives. I mean, people have come up with literally hundreds of different ideas, or sometimes they've rebaptized an existing festival or some other event under the general umbrella of the gathering. But it is going to generate a lot of visitors. I think it probably in that sense will be a success. But I find it quite extraordinary and a missed opportunity that when we talk about marketing Ireland under the general banner of Tourism Ireland, that they seem to have let the baton slip this time in terms of the failure to coordinate a campaign between North and South. It would have been an obvious occasion. It wouldn't have been politically controversial, I cannot see in any way. Well, evidently I'm wrong about that, because it is politically controversial, but it seems to me to be a very real opportunity missed to market the whole island to all of its kind of diaspora of whatever background, and I think that really is very regrettable.
Is that because of the persistence of the discourses you outlined?
Well, Brian, you could answer that better than I could.
I think we've opened up another difficult and I think,
yeah. I mean, it's hard to see what would have been controversial about the general umbrella slogan of the gathering, which would have embraced people of whatever background, and I think it's a huge opportunity lost.
Who's gathering?
Well,
one of the reasons why the gathering will work is because of the present economic situation. I think that if it was back in the Celtic Tiger era and we were talking about the gathering, there wouldn't be as much emphasis on community activities as there is today.
That's true.
Because of the economic situation, there's much more local-based community activities, and this is the reason why the gathering will work. Because you look right across, it's a bottom-up initiative. You look right across the country. I mean, there's so many people fundraising locally now to develop community halls, etc., etc. And there is a huge number of local areas interested in the gathering, and that is why it will work. It's bottom up, not top down. And if it was 5 or 6 years ago, I don't think it will work as well as it will this year.
I think that's true, and I also think that it's quite different from, in fact, what inspired it, which was Scotland. It was the Scots that came up with this idea originally, but it was done very much as a top-down initiative, and it didn't really have that sort of resonance for ordinary people across Scotland. I think they have got it right to a large extent in Ireland, though I'm not comfortable with some of the language surrounding it. Part of this was an inspiration of David McWilliams, a well-known economist down south, and he uses terms like tribal mothership, to describe this idea of coming back to Ireland. And I think there's a barely kind of there's a sort of an undertone to that I'm not comfortable with. But that said, I mean, the community response, you're absolutely right, has been fantastic. And if it works, it'll be because of that sort of commitment at the base of ordinary communities to make it work.
John, do you want to enter a little correction there, just briefly?
No, I don't really want to make any comment. Well, it's just a flippant remark, I suppose. in that there's nothing new under the sun, and I go back far enough to remember something called the Homecoming that the Northern Ireland Tourist Board organised about 30 years ago, and it didn't succeed, and it was Northern Ireland Tourist Board exclusively. It didn't include, as far as I recall, the rest of Ireland, and people were not flocking to places like this because places like this were being promoted as attractions for Americans, obviously, and it didn't really succeed. But I'm delighted to hear the optimism around the gathering, and it'll be wonderful if it does.
It's worth saying as well that we were here before in the south as well. Back in 1954, they organised something called An Tostal. But in fact, it didn't work, and I suppose you'd have to say we didn't have the infrastructure at the time to deal with large numbers of visitors anyway. So it petered out, though it did continue on in one town, in Leitrim, Manor Hamilton, where it has gone on year after year, and it's still going. It's now part of the gathering. So,
well, ladies and gentlemen, I think at that point maybe we... Paddy, sorry, Sir Peter, you do want to...
Yes. Just one comment. When you said An Tostal, that took me back to my generation, so to speak. I have the greatest regard for An Tostal. They invited me to play golf at the Grange, and I actually won £10 from An Tostal.
A lot of money then.
And I was invited to the dinner that night, and when I went into the dinner, and I saw there was a bottle of whiskey set out for every person. The whole bottle. Jimmy O'Dee's brother was playing the piano, and when I left, actually, oddly enough, I left in my own car.
We won't go there.
A 10-year-old Boris Minor, and I drove it back to Trinity, where I was staying. I'd left Trinity at that time, where I was staying with a friend. But I never saw so many inebriated people, guests, hosts, the whole shebang were all absolutely full, I remember, when I left. And that's what I remember of An Tostal. And of course, if I recall, somebody stole the plastic flames they had up in O'Connell Street, between O'Connell Street and Westminster Street. Anyhow, sorry. Just one point, if I may. I think you showed that the better educated or the better successful, the more successful, tended to come back more than the others. And I think you said that at first sight is paradoxical. And if I'm right, then it's only, to me, it's just not first sight, it's second sight, third sight, and so on. Or is there some simple explanation for it?
Well, part of it is that in the Irish tradition anyway, if you emigrated and you didn't do well, then you didn't come back. There was a whole question of shame. And again, going back, I mentioned John Healy earlier on. There's a very powerful passage in John Healy's book, 19 Acres, which at least one person in the audience will certainly know. That's you, Jack, at the back. And in 19 Acres, he talks about going over to New York. He gets a Fulbright scholarship for journalism, and this is 1957. And he's grown up with, this Aunt Mary figure sending back the parcel, the American parcel that a certain generation will remember every year. And he goes over and he's full of this, first visit with Aunt Mary and what it's going to be like to meet her. And instead of discovering that she has a fine house and so on, she lives in a tenement. And she has a son who gets up and starts every day with a beer. He's unemployed. And the whole thing has been a complete myth. But I think it illustrates that idea that if you didn't succeed, in many cases, people lost touch and certainly didn't come back. Whereas the generation I'm thinking of would be the people who came back in the 1990s, and the typical example would be the person who started, for instance, on a building site, but then worked up to becoming his own subcontractor, and then came back and started a similar business in Celtic Tiger Ireland. And I know that's a very gendered way of putting it. I'm not as sure whether the same is true for women, for instance, as for men. I think we need to do more work on that.
Only people who had success could afford to come back.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's been described as a tour de force. I'm not going to dissent from that. Could we thank our speaker, Dr. Piers McHenry?
Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. It really was a fantastic audience. I really enjoyed the questions. Can I just give one small plug? We're actually running this project down south at the moment on emigration now, as I mentioned already. And we have a website, and the web address is Emigre, E-M-I-G-R-E. You see it there. .ucc.ie. And we also have on that site, among other things, the largest online collection of Irish folk songs of emigration anywhere in the world. There's more than 100, and you can listen to them all. So if you're not interested in the technicalities of the project, you can at least listen to the music. So
is it confined to people in the Republic?
The
filling in of the answering of the question?
It is, because we're using the Southern Census
as
a yeah.
Okay, well, we look forward to seeing the
outcome. It's not over yet, ladies and gentlemen. Just to explain we're going to lunch, but we're going to try and take advantage of the sunshine outside. So we've got a small presentation to make to Piers, but we'd like to do it while we're all grouped for a photograph just outside the door. So if you'd like to gather your things, because we're going over, we'll have a quick photograph, make a short presentation to Piers, and then we'll head over to lunch. And then about 1:30, we'll all four gather in the visitor centre and head over to the Mellon Centre. We may or may not get a song of emigration at that stage. We'll see. Okay, so thank you once again, Piers. Thank you very much indeed.